There are about three smaller extensions and elaborations that I wanted to make. Uh, with regard to the invisibility that association or affiliation, or let's say a special kind of promotion and service that one is doing for the identity confers, um, is is the power of invisibility in some sense, uh, because the identity itself is like incommensurate with the groundwork, is an abstract kind of a mother or queen of the collective principle, which is sort of overlaid on top of everything that has to do to facilitate it. So it's a kind of like it's a hidden ruler, and so it's quite a nice ruling mentality or ideology because and this is why celebrities flock to it, because they can earn their virtue by facilitating and promoting the identity, and it's a very abstract sort of thing. Um, but they can be a good ally, and therefore they can gain that power of invisibility, and then the things that they are promoting um, are for thee and not for me, and so that power of invisibility, it's quite when you see through it, it's quite conspicuous. But I mean, it also happens on the same level as the lowly lieutenant, as the lowly field marshal that is trying to mobilize these kind of ideological implements for social manipulation and for their kind of immediate psychological gratification in terms of getting their sadistically edged um, interface um, uh, justified. But anyway, in terms of the adherent side, which I have tried to also model, is that the identity itself is kind of like borderline personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder is is fairly well defined because it's a personality disorder in the uh, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. But the problem with covert narcissism is not just like a variant of borderline, is not a variant of a narcissistic personality disorder. Covert narcissism is not in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's Yeah, so it's a lot harder. It's also called vulnerable narcissism. That was the word that I thought sort of started with a D when I was trying to. Is it called defensive or something like that? But it's called vulnerable narcissism disorder. And the reason why I was thinking of the word defensive is because it's 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 almost like passive aggression on a kind of on a narrative scale, on a meta scale. Um, and so they can sort of be sadistic while sort of being rationally cold and calculated and passive, as it were. So all of their aggression is somewhat sort of packaged into these kinds of these grand narrative claims, and essentially this comes from being able to chair reality, being able to sort of be the emperor of saying who belongs to what and who is doing what, and essentially when you're dealing with anyone, you've already just projected this narrative onto them. They're not allowed to have a competing say because they're outnumbered essentially in the game of social manipulation or whatever upon which this is all predicated. And also how essentially the borderline personality disordered identity, which has these which has this facility of being able to always cast a new narrative in whatever new scenario and conditions come around. So if they concede anything which somewhat breaks the narrative can very easily just be reconstituted with whatever broke the last one will just be like one of the key features of the new substrate of the new matrix which gets developed. Because whatever will replace the old condition will just merely be a new set of conditions. Because essentially the conditions will never be accountability, responsibility, self-determinism. Um, they'll always have a manifest. Even those things will have a manifestation as an external appearance, as it were, as an environmental marker to some degree. And so then they'll just track that. They will essentially, whatever is said that breaks the narrative, they'll just interpret it and reconstitute a new sociological reduction, which essentially makes the prime entity that is functioning or operating the identity. So it's identity centric, essentially, in its reduction. So it is unwilling to deal with philosophy, as it were. It will only deal in sociology. So it'll only look at itself from sort of this bird's eye perspective, from the God's eye point of view. It'll look down on everything from this objective, inverted commas, paradigm. And that essentially is the borderline, somewhat internal engine, which, I mean, I think is better just described as sort of extreme solipsism. I've got videos where I specifically talk about the internal mechanics of borderline personality disorder, where you have this internal chessboard being played, and this emphatic denial that there is that game being played, and also and the kind of the identity dysphoria, I think, if that's the term, that they get into, which means that they have this, sometimes they have a very flaky and fluid sense of identity when they need to try, when they're essentially, when they have to migrate to a new chessboard because the old chessboard is not fit for purpose. It's not, like, people aren't buying the roles that are being projected onto them in terms of the chessboard. Then or you have to essentially update your rules of the game, then the whole chessboard goes into flux, and that is what creates this identity fragility, because a new vector of attachment has to sort of work, because if people aren't invested in you to some degree, then they won't follow your rules, and then you can't map out what they're going to do in terms of the chessboard, and you won't have that absolute solipsistic control that the player of that chessboard is having. And this is also why the emotions of the borderline personality disordered person are essentially so fluid, because those are essentially just levers of social control, as it were, environmental. It's one of the many. I mean, like, because they won't just use that; they'll also use rules. They'll also use, I mean, in terms of institutional rules. I mean, like, there are legal versions of this, essentially. I mean, they can get into anything, but emotional courtesy is a somewhat an ingrained sort of general social expectation that people have in certain scenarios, and so, like, certain codes of etiquette and codes of morality, whatever codes there are that exist, will be essentially utilized by the borderline personality disorder. And emotion, in essence, is one of the big sort of unifying things. And so this is something that is often in the toolkit, and this is why their expression of emotion is it's basically the kind of it's sort of like they are the first string puppet. Their emotional state is the first string puppet in maintaining the chessboard. Anyway, but the puppet itself, if you, you know, its perspective is very immediate, very sort of instant gratification, and it actually can't know too much, because if it actually tries to have a kind of consistent knowledge, a kind of rationalized knowledge, uh, where you have a kind of a universal standard or principle, you wouldn't be able to play that kind of the gambits that are played in that chess game. You wouldn't be able to do the kind of maneuvers you can to exploit um, and repurpose and sort of recontextualize and reframe so radically, which essentially becomes the ideological virtue. Is essentially everything is a reactive repurposing that needs to reframe. Otherwise, there's absolutely nothing worth doing, because that's the depravity of the inherited situation. You know, it's always cast in the most dire, hysterical sort of terms, while engaging in this sort of divisive and sort of how to put it, this non-ideal game is ironic, because it creates a sort of a secondary economy of side effects and toxicification, which is just then also that's just added on to the external accountability. I mean, one of the most pernicious things about borderline personality disorder is just this chronic, immutable sense in which there is no self-determinism. You're not dealing with an agent. They have no responsibility for any of their actions. They will not take responsibility. It's always an external locus of control. It's just always a drama of an external locus of control, and in as much as that they can sort of pretend to have an internal locus of control, it is dependent on other people performing their role according to the chessboard. And if that decouples, if that calibration is shook, then you just see how superficial the whole charade of self-determinism was, essentially. So it's a very sort of, if you get involved with it, you start getting the spider webs on you, and then you're sort of you've been plugged into the system, and then you are forever sort of cocooned in the spider web, and sort of the spider comes for your blood, and or shoots in the poison, it dissolves all the stuff, and then it just comes in every now and again for and drinks the sort of the intoxified uh, concoction. That's how it freezes life. That's how it sort of, everything else is an inanimate object for it to wrap its webs around, and to plot and to control according to its chessboard. I mean, depending on what level you're operating on, and how sensitive you are to these sorts of meta narrative, sort of projections. Again, it's the difference between some people that can X-ray vision the landmines, and other people that are forced essentially into accepting the spider web paraphernalia that are going to be coercively projected onto it. I mean, I'm talking about in terms of the ideology of identity politics, essentially forwarding that freeze, as it were, of the identity. Anyway, the adherent of identity politics doesn't actually have borderline personality disorder, but they are codependent on the borderline personality disorder. They are promoting its interest, as it were, and because the construct of identity, I'm arguing, essentially does have borderline personality disorder, and that is what they are associated with abstractly, in their conception of this on an emotional level. They are the agent, the representative, and the promoter of that form of borderline personality disorder. So they are essentially trying to make the world safe for borderline personality disorder. And essentially, they are doing this while at the same time, essentially, they are guarding their own, or it's also assisting them. They're not. It's not pure altruism. Altruism. It is reinforcing their own vulnerable narcissism. Covert narcissism is also called vulnerable narcissism. And this I believe really is the complex. This is the psychological complex of what is happening um, on a social level of ideology. Is that because the vulnerable narcissist can depend on the social currency that identity has as just a fact, as it were, um, and because they're capable of sort of having some kind of emotional internal model of of so it's almost like that is the model of identity, that is the formula, the paradigm that they can sort of that they can draw on. um, they can take they can be offended for the identity. um, I've been I've forgotten some of the stuff. So I mean, so the yeah. So I mean, I'm going to say some things that perhaps are not strictly said about covert narcissism because it's not well understood in terms of its internal motive. I mean, they track symptoms and they track reports of things, but anyway. So what I see happening internally in terms of the internal motivation of vulnerable narcissism is that it would very much like to be able to initiate its narcissistic devices like grandiose narcissism can. Um, so grandiose narcissism is more identifiable as a personality disorder because it is functionally doing it and initiating it, whereas vulnerable narcissism takes a much longer time to set up its apparatus. Because essentially it has to make everything a guarding action. It has to make everything a defensive counteraction, a countermeasure, and that is much more likely in the vicinity of some kind of narcissistic mechanism that already exists, because there already therefore exists a level of disorientation, a level of derangement, essentially. Um, uh, This also explains, for instance, why Trump is so effective at debunking the, the 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 political stuff that he's up against, and why they're so eager to project things onto him, and why he's so sensitive to when he's being projected upon, and then so he really does sort of derange them, because his, let's say, quite benign narcissism um, essentially is directly negating room for theirs, uh, because Trump's narcissism is has frozen a world of American values. So he's a brilliant defender of just basic classical liberal values and principles, because those are the hard lines that he has programmed into his narcissism that he cannot cross. And he's going to have so anyway, I'm just going to put that aside, but that is also what is happening there. And Trump is certainly a godsend and necessary, because the culture has not caught up to these things. People cannot um, intellectually articulate and debunk identity politics yet. And so if we did not have Trump being able to do it intuitively, being able to do it somewhat with an emotional intelligence, and obviously he's also quite intelligent, but if he wasn't able essentially uh, to intuitively see through and be sensitive to the ploys and the projection going on from the identity politics of the so-called left, there would be no defense against it. And they perhaps would have already corrupted the law in America, as they have been destroying the law in South Africa. Even really good Democratic candidates in the Democratic primary, like why am I blanking? Jason, Jason Wong. The guy that is talking about UBI. I'm not sure about the economics of UBI, but he certainly deserves to have. I would think he's probably has better ideas than Bernie Sanders, and he should be considered seriously. But his platform has been completely poisoned by this identity politics stuff. He is towing the Democratic line that if it's in his policy platform, that he will implement hate speech stuff. Just all of this identity politics craziness stuff. And although many people, he's definitely sharing support of people that would vote for him, but if he doesn't get in, then they'll vote for Trump. There are a lot of sort of people that are Trump supporters that would vote for him. As far as I can see, the Democratic Party is just so poisonous that they have destroyed a candidate, because I don't think he'll even be able to get away from those policy positions. I think they should even come back to haunt him as a relegation of principle. Just to go into just to conform with the current democratic madness. Anyway. Okay. So I was talking about invisibility, and then I wanted to get into vulnerable narcissism. So what's happening in vulnerable narcissism? Yeah, you see, like, the problem with vulnerable narcissism is that, well, it's not the problem, but I was saying, if you are a vulnerable narcissist, the thing is that you already have to have quite a good reading of the lay of the land. They're very, very perceptive. What they have a problem doing is that they can't initiate their own implements. They have to sort of wait and bide their time until essentially they can see a chessboard that's workable and playable, until they've pieced together what the spider web sort of works with all the facets involved, and all the sort of the thing that make up the contextual framework of the space that they're in. When they are allied with this borderline personality disordered identity, they've got this sort of this endless, sort of well of projection that they can just subject people to, that they can sort of speak on behalf of, because they're very good at creating these rationalistic, sort of formulaic, sort of if this then that, and that is how they compel people, and that is how they communicate. You're not allowed to be this, you're not allowed to do that. And the double standard, the inconsistency and incoherence is showed up in that whenever they deploy those sorts of things, they're not deployed evenly. They're not, because it comes from a source which is fundamentally relativistic and specious. The borderline personality disorder is capable of reinventing itself 5 times before lunch. And so there is this sort of this overarching idea that the only way that you're going to even stabilize the identity is once you've really sort of made society pliable to essentially receiving that form of vulnerable narcissism, till you make society compliant with that form of vulnerable narcissism, which culminates eventually in having some kind of ad hoc administrative control over every system, that is going to be governed by the same principle, which, to call it a principle is a bit fucked up, because, as I said, it doesn't have a general principle kind of consistency within it. But that is what the Nazis would have recognized as the Führer principle, that everything must be governed by the Führer principle. Or a Führer principle, and the idea is also, can they all agree in the same savior? And so, there is a bit of a side quest going on for, let's get these legions in order, let's get them regimented, and you can see this disgustingly everywhere. Everyone is trying to find its lane in this project, and you even have supposedly Christian organizations trying to organize themselves around the principles of social justice, and academics, and everyone trying to find their domain, uh, their dominion, their sphere of dominion in this order, each ring in each, to rule over that particular space, given, as they all conform to the overarching, what binds them will be the Führer, that will sort of be the capstone over this. Anyway, the sorry, because the two elements that I want to kind of explore. So essentially, the vulnerable narcissist is given something which is always relevant, always pertinent, identity, because sociology has really been taken to be the foremost paradigm of anything and everything. Everything can be reduced into sociology, and that is given a kind of cultural hegemony, 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 and from that, they can always be vulnerable about something. Something can always be aggressing upon them, and therefore everything they do and say can be a pushback, can be wonderfully justifiable in their narrative, and so then they can essentially be consistently reactive. They can just live a reactive life, which is the easy life of any vulnerable narcissist, because if they can just purely be reactive, then because there's one element in which there is a shared element between the vulnerable narcissist and the borderline personality disordered person. The vulnerable narcissist is allergic to accountability and responsibility. They are a victim. Borderline personality disordered people will also very much get into the victim, and it can be quite scary, because they can reinvent history and reality quite selectively. They can fabricate, they can completely make up and manufacture facts which are convenient to setting themselves as the victim. Although you could say that there's a lot more self-deception happening in terms of borderline personality disorder. In terms of vulnerable narcissism, they are afraid and allergic rather than intrinsically solipsistic. So there's a much higher level of bad faith. They wish to displace the threat of being responsible with the badge of being a victim. And you can, in this dishonesty, I mean, this is why people dislike narcissists, is because their emotional language, or their emotional sentiments which they express when they're rationalizing these things and when they're saying these things, is quite an obvious ploy of self-deception, and that is the kind of disorientation which is hard to get away with unless you already live in a culture that has been fundamentally corroded, um, and already sort of been eviscerated to a large degree, which the feminists have been doing and working on for a long time, to get people uh, dislocated from um, uh, you could just call it their natural expression of their sexuality has been deprived of them. Minds have been laid in the field, and you need an excuse to be found trying to traverse that no man's land. You need something quite special about you. You need something that, because you can't do it yourself anymore. You either need some kind of something that uh, you know, because who can really prove that they are actually acting in the advancement and the promotion of the identity? How can you actually prove that to yourself? There is a fundamental um, lack of legitimacy within their own mentality, which can essentially only be it can only be fixed by finding someone who is less legitimate than you are, and fucking them up essentially. So there's this um, scapegoat mechanism right from the start, and this cannibalistic sort of tendency that if you don't sort of punish the non-believers, or there's no way to prove that your sister that there is fidelity. The ideological fidelity, in fact, is only evidenced by essentially examples of ideological heresy and inexactitude of performing to the standard that is somehow just pervasively fudged and thumbsucked. And so because the whole thing is a collective project that's somewhat crowdsourced, so it's also vague and uncertain in so many ways that without a Führer that you accept as the Führer that will eventually come and will sort of create a concrete um, orthodoxy. They're crying out for an orthodoxy. So this is the problem. I mean, this is what Hitler would have called proto-fascism. Well, no, sorry, he wouldn't have called it proto-fascism. He just would have called them useful idiots. So this group of useful idiots who already buy into the fascistic conception of society and think themselves to be more intellectually attuned than actual fascists are are in great desperate want of a coalescing figure, um, who will actually fulfill and cement and stabilize um, their uh, the rules essentially, so that the borderline element, the identity element, can stop being a chameleon, and it can just have a kind of a stable vision of where of what is being come out of existence or whatever. The problem is that even the fascists can't sustain this. They can't have a stable vision, because because you become a victim of your own success, and they cannot actually endure their own ideological success, because then they actually lose all necessity. If things are actually going their way, they lose sense of reality even faster, because it is because although philosophically it's much more to do with sympathizing with the borderline personality disorder identity, in practice it's all about the vulnerable narcissism of the adherent. And if and the less ambiguity that you have around the identity, the more consistency is demanded from the adherent. And if you deprive them of being able to just sort of project at will at onto people, then you know what are they doing it for? I mean, they're not going to be able to get their, they're going to have to sort of behave themselves according to at least one moral code, which will allow them to essentially burn some people at the stake, but they can't use it as a convenient defense mechanism. It's actually that the ideology moves into a mode in which um, it actually starts to sort of self-limit, at least because it is made up of this codependency. And so um well, yeah, so it is very interesting that that the adherents do want things to be up in the air. They do want this sort of eternal civil war. That is its natural state. um and and in that murkiness, you get these which probably they already exist. You get these Gestapo type manifestations of secret societies, perhaps, or secret gangs. Um, you know, which is really the tendency which I believe is going to be fostered by this kind of cultural um, accumulation, and they're going to be centered around identity, and because that'll be the only way that people will be able to access reality and to actually deal with things, because the public voice and the public sphere is just completely dominated by this toxic, vague milieu of identity obsession, and that is the canonical orthodoxy which cannot be brought into a sharp focus that is consistent with people's interpersonal relations and communication with one another. Because if you try to do that, someone will say you're not allowed to do or say that, because I'm rationalizing the identity focus, which you are obscuring, or you're not allowed to say, because constructively what you are doing is you are touching those identity relics, and they are sacred, they are above you, and you don't come from the right place in order to pronounce upon them. So there is this policing faction, essentially, that is depriving culture and the personal sphere, the public sphere, of freedom of association, freedom of expression, um, and so obviously you're going to force that into an underground sort of state. And I mean, to some degree, it's not necessarily. I mean, it's not completely hopeless, but the problem is that you are going to get pockets of people that are fundamentally backwards and toxic. And if those pockets aren't pierced by individuals that have the right answers, that can sort of, go in there and inject some common sense and some good philosophy and some kind of understanding about these things, you could get cells, you get cells of very um, dangerous people. Uh, uh, Also individuals, I guess. Uh, what else can be said about this? Vulnerable narcissism. Yeah, I do have an example. I do have another recording that is just talking about like the definitions of these things and how I see them internally working, and I haven't reconstructed them terribly well, apart from saying that they're allergic to responsibility, and they want to sort of they want to clothe all their actions as a reactive, as a reaction to coercion, to somebody else's trespassing, essentially. So essentially everything is in the valence of the idea that they have been trespassed upon, or something has been trespassed upon, and they are the good Samaritan for defending the borderline personality disordered identity. So they essentially they have a victim that they can ally themselves with. And it's interesting as well because whenever they bring these things up, the crime itself is never real. The crime itself is an ideological crime. It's always, yes, so you should change your thinking because of this exchange, because in the long run your thinking will lead to bad behavior. It's never like, oh, you have said this. Well, I mean, I guess they also say you have said this, and so you have upset some people that have overheard you, and you have intellectually infuriated other people, including myself, for having said this. So fix your thinking, because otherwise you're going to be dangerous, and in fact, we're going to also. And then they usually give not even such a concealed threat that they will threaten your safety because your ideas are dangerous to the victims. That is essentially the archetypal sort of what's the stereotype of the exchange that they want to get into. Because if they can, especially if they can do that part about essentially being violent at the end in terms of this radical cause, because that just puts the kind of the capstone on it that they have sealed uh, the they have sealed the complex in a successful skirmish in which they are the avatar. They are um, the they are the completed avatar of the codependent. They have synthesized properly the union, and then they have found a place to deploy it. I mean, the problem is that that might work very well against a white male or something like that, who is the prime victim, or sort of the prime target, the prime scapegoat. But when it gets essentially they are the only safe ones that you can do that with. um, but then the kind of the degrees of potential conflict and who is in whose lane, once you get with people that are sort of in the middle, in the midst of these things, you know it doesn't have a concrete structure to it. So essentially everyone is forced into sort of just going after the easiest target as a way to have cohesion, and to sort of prove that there is a cohesive promise that it can actually do great things, that it can do profound things, that it can do radical things. Um, and this is also why in politics there is such an obsession going on about racism, when racism is probably quite low on the list of things that are sabotaging development and transformation in this country. Um, and in fact, this whole circus has created new forms of racism, um, which are, yeah, with probably more racism on the one side than the other side. If you catch my drift. But anyway, I'm not going to get into those sorts of dynamics. But there's another. Um, vulnerable narcissism. Okay, there were some ancillary things that I wanted to add. Yeah, the envy and pride model is also worth looking at in terms of this, but I'm not going to bring that up again. The translation of envy into pride. So, in the envy of the vulnerable narcissist uh, is is not envy and pride, but although it is indirectly also expressed as a form of, or I mean, this is when they talk about pride, identitarian pride. This is actually what they mean is jealousy, and jealousy is not the same thing as envy. Jealousy means that something was taken from us, and so the translation of envy on behalf of the vulnerable narcissist becomes the identity's jealousy. Um, and because the identity, being borderline personality disorder, is somewhat amorphous, you can just get it to adopt, you can get it to spit out uh, um, an explanation uh, um, of how the adherent is representing a form of jealousy that sort of works in this generalized way, that works in this roundabout thing, and because it's a generalized jealousy, um, you know, it's quite problematic because I mean that is very far detached from reality. It's very far detached from, well, if this jealousy belongs to the identity, how does that relate to an individual of that identity? Somehow they get a share in it. How do you get a share in jealousy? You're either jealous about something or you aren't. It's something that pertains to an individual. Um, the idea that jealousy pertains to an abstract group entity, is fundamentally unsound. It's fundamentally disorientating, because how does that even work? What happens if you have a member of an identity who can't be jealous about that for themselves because they even have it? You have a black millionaire who has something, but then the identity is still jealous of that thing that they have. How does that work? It works in the generalization. So it's this strange thing that, like, well, you'll know it when you see it. I guess it's fundamentally amorphous, and because it has no yeah, and so the covert narcissist essentially has um, this inexhaustible well of envy, because essentially that is the only way that they can move forward. And as vulnerable narcissists, you don't really have positive values. You can only, uh, I think that they're very aware of their own desire, um, as being modeled to them by others. Um, and so they actually, this ideology is one of the ways in which they can actually get forward momentum within their own psyches, because this is why I think also the Germans, in a sense, needed the Jews to model themselves against, because the Jews, even their conception of them, they accused the Jews of doing all the things that they did as a nation, effectively National Socialism. So um, they were trying to. It's quite ironic, but from the German perspective, or from the Nazi perspective, they were interpreting um, their nation as a Jewish family, essentially, and was a reaction to a Jewish family. It's this very strange sort of inverse mirroring effect that happens because of vulnerable narcissism being fundamentally reactive, which can only be covered over because the identity itself is fundamentally relativistic and solipsistic, and sees itself as the source of everything. Um, And so when you've got these two things together, you can have such overt cognitive dissonance, such overt compartmentalization, where you become the exact thing that you complain about. You become colonialistic uh, uh, overtly, in your organization, in your mentality, um, and essentially, and if that is ever shown up, it's the excuse is sort of, well, there's no alternative, like there's nothing else, you know. So much agency and imagination has been given over into the identity sausage factory or machine. It's better to just call it the fudging, the identity, the fudge of the identity centric paradigm. Yeah. So the okay. Anyway, but the envy jealousy thing is another way to see the abstract representation of the identity's jealousy with the vulnerable narcissist's immediate sense of envy. Which it's ironic because, I mean, perhaps they're not even envious. Perhaps they just have narcissistic rage. But rationally, it is a claim about envy. They are actually saying, I'm envious. Like, listen, if you actually listen to the things that they are saying, their actual complaint is rationally founded in envy. They're like, I'm experiencing envy right now, and you are making me feel envious, and my identity is jealous of these things, and it deserves to be jealous. So you should try to facilitate my envy and to quell it and to provide to it and satiate it. Because otherwise you are committing a crime against my identity. That is the form of the adherent of identity politics. That is the form of their argument. They are owning up to envy, because it has this ideological process internally which covers it. Um, to to the extent to which the adherent is communicating envy, the identity is professing the jealousy that justifies and necessitates. And again, like, this is emotionally unsustainable. You can't, this is why you could say slightly responsibly, the adherents of this eventually demand segregation. Um, I mean, sadly, that won't be enough, because once they get anything that they ask for, it won't be enough, and then it'll just be the next thing, and it'll be, even more divisive and self-sabotaging and self-agonizing, because then they'll complain that, why aren't we provided the same XYZ? So it's like, the separate but equal juggling circus, sort of is never going to end, and eventually they will manifest into, the kind of the Black Panthers kind of radical agitation, um, and probably even domestic terrorism, probably. I mean, that's certainly, I believe, is what is being experienced in South Africa, where you have always infrastructure being burnt down, um, buses being burnt, trains being burnt. Um, it is very clear that these things are politically motivated. Anyway, so I mean, all these things are far more accelerated in South Africa. We're probably in the same way that the same culture took over the world during Weimar Germany, and when Hitler was very popular in the English speaking world. The Democrats in America, for instance, really sympathized with this way of thinking, as they have always, essentially, to some degree. Obviously, not everyone in the party. Some people can see through it, but to a large extent, the Nazi sympathizers were the blue D's, but what's my point here? Yeah, so I mean, if we see that the same thing is happening again, South Africa is Weimar Germany essentially, and we've got a weak political establishment that is essentially, they have very close to a majority in parliament. Like the president himself is not officially part of this faction, but he's not necessarily against them. So the ruling party already has many people who buy into identity politics. The courts have already corrupted themselves, so it's very similar to what happened in Weimar Germany. Which is even more egregious because our constitution and our form of law was really so antithetical to this stuff. It's directly in the law that there is opposition to everything that in which the moral corruption and the corruption of the state has occurred. It has been unconstitutional and against the rule of law, but identity politics has just been adopted by as the ruling interpretation of everything. It is the foremost codex that unlocks reality, and so we live in a state that is fundamentally compliant and in its facilitation of the looming fascism. And the organization of the ruling party is so weak itself, it is not able to purge its own ranks. The turning point was really Thabo Mbeki, who tried to get rid of these people, but he did so at a point in time when he was politically weak and he was taken out by the Treatment and Action campaign. Very, very bad timing. We would have perhaps lived in a very different country if that hadn't have happened. That hadn't have happened. Anyway. Just to further elaborate on the point of the vulnerable narcissism and the envy, because this I saw as a good opportunity to get into this mechanic of self-sabotage, essentially, or self-debilitation. Because essentially it's so much easier to navigate life by interpreting challenges and obstacles and problems as an object of envy that can be referred to the identity, essentially to cover it with some kind of, well, it should already belong to you through because this was deprived of the identity, this was taken from the identity. Because it's so easy essentially to depend on interpreting challenges and issues as an object of envy in the adherent, instead of actually just confronting them and also realizing how nothing is just, I mean, I guess, conceivably for some people, some things are made easy for them. Perhaps not even so, though. I mean, like, just because you might be incredibly rich doesn't mean that you necessarily have the kind of support, the kind of maturity and development, and also, asking the right people the right questions, as it were. There's often, I think, a lot of self-debilitation that happens in decadence, although decadence is not something that is limited to people with wealth. I mean, this ideological decadence essentially is so rich with its own facility of this endless a resource of envy, essentially, that if you can just interpret everything as being something that you are righteously envious of, then you never actually have to confront anything. You never actually have to make your way, except by trying to promote the cause of the identity, and how therefore this thing that you envy should just be dispensed to you. It should just be granted to you. And when you have that mechanism, it is a self-deluding but also self-fulfilling prophecy, because then essentially, then the only way that you will receive it or obtain it, or achieve it, is if it is merely granted to you by some kind of infantilizing or paternalistic aspect of some structure which is imposed and intervenes on your behalf in the name of the identity, which, so once you've got this mechanism, essentially, I mean, the problem is as well is that because the envy itself is fundamentally flawed, in that it doesn't, even if that is the premise upon which you proceed, with which you obtain the thing, if that premise gets accepted, the displacement of fidelity, of actual trust, of actual integrity in the system, the displacement of dignity that occurs because your envy strategy has actually been placated, it has been assented to by the system. You've got this ideological permissiveness of this function, right, creates a whole slew of an endless sort of uh, because of all the elements that are missing in that, you have to come up with even more rationalization as to how much jealousy the identity has over those things which the individual is envious of and deserves to receive because of the identity. And so the prominence of the identity is emphasized and obsessed in, and sort of reveled in, and that is ramped up to hysterical proportions. And this is always why, at the base of it, there's this emotional argument that when you actually try to get into the actual mechanics of it, and how it is illegitimate on a functional level, on a practical level, how it just breaks down, you get into this very visceral, emotional, reactive, kind of hysterical, talking about victims, and talking and dredging up history, and telling these narratives, of trying to project that narrative onto it's happening again. It's always, if you're not allowed to use this form of artificial redress, then it completely collapses any kind of notion of redress, or some kind of progressive realization of equality. You can't, it's just nothing, there's no other possible form of dealing with the issue. There's no other possible way. It's which, I mean, obviously there are possible ways. In fact, it's much easier, and it's much more direct, and it's much more efficacious to actually deal with disadvantages as they exist in individuals' lives, not as they exist as a historical mechanism that needs to be fixed. Because how can you ever fix history? It's not even conceptually. It's fake. And when you're trying to create this generalized syndrome of jealousy that you are fundamentally focused on curing, the individual is permitted this mechanism of envy, effectively, which then has a whole secondary identity consciousness economy within culture, which is, I mean, you can only describe it as the fascistic conception of society, of just seeing everyone being a token representative of their group. Of, you know, it's just fundamentally dehumanizing. It's fundamentally permits government to instrumentalize citizens, and treat them in such a way to as facilitate any amount of moral depravity and corruption, and ad hoc administrative, you know, you just have officials being given power over people's lives in a way that will never be consistent with general principles, because it all just is one part of fixing a generalized problem, a generalized statistic. So everything, even if it is a misappropriation because it's going to the wrong individual, or the wrong thing is happening to the wrong individual, and that is unfair, it's made fair because the generalization is the level at which the most fairness needs to occur, because the jealousy of the identity needs to be the prominent aspect, rather than caring if this person is interpreting and projecting envy onto things that they could very easily obtain if they actually just had a mind to actually seek constructive, proactive means of engaging with the issue, rather than just becoming a reactive, sort of self-sabotaging cog in the ideological machine of, you know, going to university and doing as many extramurals as you're encouraged to do to make up for your unlived, unbest life. You know, there's this sort of this really perverse incentive. So yeah, the excessive use of this same mechanism, uh, instead of actually getting on with actually seeing what the actual gap is in terms of attainment of certain things, and working on ameliorating that gap, or working on policies that address that directly, or solutions that address that directly. Those are all somewhat lost in the obsession over redress to the identity, and the prime moral consideration which is placed in identity politics on the identity itself. What else? Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. I guess it just is part of the point that the vulnerable narcissism wing of this essentially is a self propelling ideological force. If you don't actually tackle it head on, if you don't confront it, and you don't sort of unveil something about its self aggravating character, uh, it will just metastasize. As a cancer, it will take over more and more of culture. Um, you know, people can experience it to some degree, and know that there's something wrong about it, that there's fundamentally something wrong about its proponents, that they all sound the same, they all use the same kind of cherry picked sort of logic. You know, it has a very kind of specious rationalism that it conforms with. And, you know, without its double standards, it doesn't stand for very long. But, you know, try to underline those double standards without actually explaining why it is producing them, without talking about why it has these tendencies within it. And you're not, I think, going to make successful enough inroads that you're going to be able to deflate and rebut their ideological, psychological machine that they have going. Okay, the last recording is very long, so I'm just going to stop this now. But yeah, I mean the example. Yeah, okay, I give the example.